18 months. That is the promise. The timeline, the illusion. A president looks into the camera and declares that American oil companies can be back in Venezuela pumping, producing, stabilizing prices in less time than it takes to build a single refinery. It sounds bold, it sounds efficient, it sounds like power, but oil does not respond to speeches. It responds to steel, capital, institutions, and time. Venezuela holds the largest proven oil reserves on earth. Yet today, those reserves sit beneath a system hollowed out by decades of decline, legal conflict, and broken infrastructure. This is where politics and economics collide. Because reclaiming oil is not about removing a leader. It is about rebuilding a machine. If you want to understand why grand promises so often collapse under economic gravity, stay with me. To see the reality behind this claim, we first need to define the problem itself, clearly, calmly, and without illusion. Let's be precise about what is actually being claimed. The argument is simple on the surface. Remove Nicolás Maduro, open the doors, invite American oil companies in, and Venezuela's oil sector comes back to life, quickly, profitably, strategically. But buried inside that claim are several assumptions that deserve scrutiny. First, that Venezuela's oil decline is primarily political, not structural. Second, that private capital will rush in before legal and institutional certainty is restored. And third, that oil reserves automatically translate into usable supply. None of those assumptions are guaranteed. Venezuela does not lack oil. It lacks functioning infrastructure, stable governance, and confidence from investors who have seen assets nationalized, contracts rewritten, and compensation delayed. Even American companies acknowledge this reality, speaking cautiously, avoiding commitments, and waiting for clarity. So the real issue is not ambition, it is feasibility. And to understand why feasibility matters more than force, we need to go backward into history and see how Venezuela's oil system arrived at this point. To understand Venezuela's oil crisis, we have to resist the temptation to see it as sudden. This decline did not begin with Nicolás Maduro. It began decades earlier, quietly, structurally, predictably. Venezuela nationalized its oil industry in 1976, placing the state at the center of extraction, investment, and control. For years, high prices masked inefficiency. Revenue flowed in even as maintenance lagged and expertise drained away. Then, in 2007, President Hugo Chavez tightened state control further, forcing foreign firms into new arrangements and triggering legal battles that still echo today. Confidence eroded. Capital hesitated, talent left. Oil production, once among the world's highest, began its long descent. This is the central economic mechanism at work. Oil systems decay slowly, then fail suddenly. Wells corrode, refineries age, pipelines leak. And without constant reinvestment, decline becomes exponential. By the time politics turned volatile, the machinery was already fragile. So when leaders promise rapid revival, they are not confronting a single moment of collapse, but an entire cycle of neglect. And that brings us to the first real crisis point. What changed everything was not ideology, it was consequence. When foreign companies were pushed out and assets were reasserted under state control, the system lost more than ownership. It lost capability. And once that happened, the decline accelerated. By the late 2000s, Venezuela's oil output was no longer slipping, it was breaking. Facilities went offline, skilled engineers left the country, maintenance budgets vanished. What remained was a vast reserve trapped beneath failing infrastructure. This was the first true crisis because oil production is not reversible on command. You cannot pause decay and then press resume. Every year of underinvestment compounds the next. Corrosion spreads, heavy crude becomes harder to process, restarting wells costs far more than keeping them alive. This is why analysts warned that recovery would require tens of billions of dollars and many years, not months. So when bold timelines are announced, they collide with this moment in history where neglect became structural damage. If you want to see how that damage is hidden beneath optimistic language, stay with me. Because the most important forces here are not visible, they are embedded in the system itself. What lies beneath all of this is a misunderstanding of how oil systems actually work. Oil is not extracted by optimism. It is governed by incentives, risk, and institutional memory. Venezuela's crude is heavy, difficult to refine, expensive to transport, and unforgiving to neglect. That means production depends not just on drilling, but on specialized equipment, steady maintenance, and long-term planning. Here is the hidden mechanism. Capital moves only when rules are predictable. American oil companies do not fear geology. They fear uncertainty. Who owns the assets? Which contracts will be honored? What happens when politics shifts again? This is why, even now, companies speak cautiously. They monitor. They wait. They avoid promises. One firm remains, others stay silent. Political authority can open doors, but it cannot force patience nor manufacture trust. And without trust, investment stalls. So the idea that production can surge quickly misunderstands the system itself, because oil is not revived by access alone, but by confidence over time. And that brings us to the second pressure point, where expectations meet human reality. The second crisis emerges when political vision meets corporate hesitation, because after the speeches, after the cameras are gone, the decisions fall to engineers, investors, and boards of directors, people trained to distrust speed. Restoring Venezuela's oil production is not just expensive, it is risky. Projects would require tens of billions of dollars before yielding meaningful output. And even then, returns would arrive slowly, stretched across years. That timeline clashes directly with political cycles that demand immediate results. There is also a technical reality. Venezuela's heavy crude requires specialized refining capacity. Much of that infrastructure has deteriorated. Restarting it is not a switch, it is a reconstruction. And so companies hesitate. They ask whether a stable government will last, whether contracts will survive future elections, whether compensation disputes from the past will finally be resolved. This is the second crisis, expectation versus execution. Political leaders can promise speed, markets demand certainty. When those two forces collide, momentum stalls, not because opportunity is absent, but because risk is unresolved. And in that pause, time keeps working against the system. Because while negotiations continue and optimism circulates, infrastructure continues to age. And the consequences of that delay do not stay confined to boardrooms. They travel outward to ordinary lives. For the people of Venezuela, this debate is not abstract. It is not about barrels, contracts, or timelines. It is about daily life. When oil production collapsed, so did the economy built around it. Wages lost value, public services weakened, energy wealth that once funded schools, hospitals, and basic stability evaporated. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Oil systems fail slowly, but people feel the pain immediately. If production does not return, jobs do not return. If investment hesitates, recovery hesitates. If uncertainty lingers, ordinary people carry the cost. This is where I want you to pause. Because when you hear promises of rapid revival, ask yourself who benefits first and who waits longest. Economic transitions are not neutral. They distribute pain unevenly. And for millions of Venezuelans, the waiting has already lasted years. If you care about how political decisions translate into human consequences, this is the moment to stay engaged, to look past rhetoric and toward reality. Because the story does not end at national borders. What happens next reaches far beyond Venezuela. What happens in Venezuela does not stay in Venezuela. Oil is a global system. And when a country with the world's largest proven reserves collapses as a producer, The effects ripple outward, quietly, unevenly, but persistently. In theory, a revived Venezuelan oil sector could add supply, easing pressure on global prices. That is the geopolitical appeal. More oil means more flexibility, more leverage, more stability, at least on paper. But analysts remain skeptical for a reason. Even if American firms invest, even if projects move forward, meaningful output would arrive slowly, years, not months, and global markets respond to flows, not promises. There is also a strategic dimension. Energy policy is no longer just about abundance. It is about resilience, supply chains, political risk, long-term credibility. So other producers adjust, other governments hedge, markets wait. This is the paradox. Venezuela matters enormously and yet cannot quickly change the global balance. And that disconnect between expectation and impact creates its own form of instability. Because when geopolitical narratives outrun economic timelines, miscalculation follows. To understand where this path leads, we now have to look forward and imagine what comes next. Looking ahead, there are only a few plausible paths, and none of them are simple. The first is the optimistic scenario. Political stability holds, legal disputes are resolved, American companies invest patiently. Over time, infrastructure is rebuilt, confidence returns, and production rises slowly, steadily. Venezuela re-enters the global oil system not as a shock, but as a gradual contributor. The second is a middle path. Investment comes, but cautiously. Projects move forward in limited phases. Output improves, but remains constrained. Venezuela produces more oil, yet never recaptures its former scale. Expectations adjust downward, and the system stabilizes at a lower equilibrium. Then there is the worst case. Political uncertainty returns. Contracts are questioned, capital withdraws, infrastructure continues to decay. In this scenario, reserves remain underground, immense, tantalizing, and unusable. The promise of revival becomes another missed cycle. What determines which future prevails is not geology. It is institutions. Oil rewards patience, credibility, and continuity. Without them, even the largest reserves become irrelevant. And that is the lesson leaders often forget. Because the future is not decided by declarations, but by systems that endure after the speeches fade. Which brings us to the final question. What should we learn from this moment? This moment tells us something larger, not just about Venezuela, but about power in the modern world. We live in an age that prizes speed. Fast decisions, fast outcomes, fast headlines. But oil, like economics, like institutions, does not bend to urgency. You can remove a leader overnight. You cannot rebuild trust overnight. You cannot reverse decades of decay on a political timetable. Venezuela's story reminds us that resources are not destiny. Systems are. And when systems are weakened, even the greatest advantages lose meaning. For policymakers, the lesson is humility. For markets, it is caution. And for citizens watching from afar, it is clarity. When you hear bold promises about rapid transformation, ask what lies beneath them: incentives, institutions, and time. Because the real power in global affairs is not the power to act quickly. It is the power to sustain. If you want more analysis like this, calm, clear, and grounded in reality, stay with me. Share this conversation. Question the narratives you're given. And in the next video, we'll ask an even harder question. What happens when political ambition consistently outruns economic gravity?